Hi everyone, I'm Dave Butler.
I'm Grace Freeman.
Welcome to Don't Miss This.
Our scripture study class.
Y'all, today, Book of Mormon chapters. We're in Alma 8 through 12. And if you're new, we moved through the scriptures this year, the Book of Mormon, chunk by chunk, and talking about things that we think you don't want to miss. And I was thinking today while I was studying, I was just like, really? I think I want to emphasize and say we only can cover some of the really cool things, because I, like chapter 8, for example, I feel like I circled so many things that I was like, that's a really cool lesson. And that is such a cool lesson. And that is such a cool lesson, you know? Anyways,
Yes.
So I hope that these lessons are leading you back into the scriptures and kind of, I don't know, just kind of, they become a training ground for finding like cool one-liners and different phrases and the ability to apply this and see its relevance. And anyways, I just thought that today while we were studying, because there's some really, really great stuff that you could just pick out and like emphasize and study more and like pick to teach. And I think one of the best pieces of advice for a teacher or a speaker is avoid that temptation to teach everything.
Yeah.
And just
Yes.
find that one or two things that you just love. Anyways, I think you really sense that when you study these. But let's jump in. This is Alma, a continuation. If you've been going along with us, Alma, remember, starts going from city to city, and he's teaching. He gave up his job as the chief judge, the government position, and now he's really focusing on his calling as the high priest of the church. And he's kind of taken on that responsibility to do something. If not me, then who? Is kind of what he's done, right? I should go out and help and do this. And we just come off of chapter 7 where he's in the land of Gideon, and he had such a sweet experience. In fact, I wrote in my chapter 8, make sure you start at the end of 7. You know, remember, chapter headings and breaks got put into the Book of Mormon later, and so sometimes they will cut off like a thought that's going or a feeling that you should have had beforehand to really appreciate it. And I think you really appreciate what happens in 8 if you start at the end of 7, where he just says, he gives a apostolic prophetic blessing to the city of Gideon at the end of 7. And I want to claim that blessing. It's so sweet. And if you read it in that context, sometimes in conference or when an apostle will come and visit one of our, your state conference or something like that, they will leave an apostolic blessing. And those are so sweet and they're so special. And you get one here at the end of 7. And look at, he's just giving them this blessing. May the Lord bless you in 25, that you may be brought to sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the holy prophets who have been ever since the world was, having your garments spotless as theirs are. And now, my beloved brethren, I've spoken these words unto you, according to the Spirit in me, and my soul rejoices because of the diligence and the heed which you've given to my word. And now may the peace of God rest upon you, and upon your houses, and your lands, and your flocks, and your herds, and all that you own, and your women and your children, according to your faith and good works, from this time forever. Like, it just is a sweet blessing. And then you get into chapter 8, and he has a really discouraging experience. He goes into the city of Ammonihah, which we're going to be in for a little bit, for the next couple of chapters, and even into next week. And he has this really discouraging experience from them, because he finds out in verse 9, Satan had gotten great hold upon the hearts of the people of that city. I like how the Book of Mormon, by the way, emphasizes so much the hearts and the intentions of people. There's so much about like, this is not a behavior problem, but it's a heart problem. And I just like that the Book of Mormon, I've just started noticing that more and more.
And
in here.
I think we talk a lot about God winning over our hearts, but I think it's really interesting in the Book of Mormon how much of a fight it is. That as much as God is trying to win over your hearts, Satan is also trying to win your heart.
Yeah.
And I think it's so interesting to look at yourself like that and realize that you're not just giving your heart to God. I think sometimes we just think, oh, that's so easy. Just let God have your heart. Just believe in him. It's so easy. But you're forgetting that it's really a fight. Satan's really also trying to win it as well.
Yeah.
And I think you need to realize that, to be like, oh, wait, this really is about my heart. And all the actions are based in the heart, but your heart is very valuable. Valuable enough that two of the most powerful beings are fighting for it.
Yeah. Which is really cool to think about when you think about protecting your heart. And also, I'm not ready, I don't think, to talk about this quite yet, because I need some more time to let it settle in, and it'll come up again. but just like what that means for someone to have a hold of your heart. Like, anyways, I'm really intrigued by that.
Yeah.
But so they kick him out, and he tries so hard, and it says that they spit on him, and they revile him, they cast him out of their city, and what a contrast with where he just was. This sweet blessing he gives on everyone, the sweet sermon that he delivered, and they're just, it was so, like the stars all like aligned, and it was like, and he
probably was thinking like, this is working. Like, this is going to be good.
Yeah.
People are going to love this. This is so worth my time. And
then, like, there's nothing worse than being rejected. I don't know much about that, but like I just heard that. But particularly when it's something that's so important to you, In fact, you know what? I just had this memory the other day as a missionary of I had this man in my ward in Korea who was deaf. And so he wouldn't come to church because he didn't understand anything. And so I was like, I'm going to wake up an hour early.
I hope you're about to tell the story that I think you're going to tell.
No, I don't think I am, because it's not funny. It's terrible. Because you started grinning.
Going.
And I would wake up, and I'm not trying to like toot my own horn, but like an hour early so I could learn sign language so that I could translate church for this guy. So I did that, and we had a great relationship, and we loved each other, and I learned Korean Sign Language. And I got to a subway station one day, and I saw these two ladies like signing back and forth.
It is this.
Oh, it is.
Sorry that I'm mocking you.
You're mocking like a really like. I was Alma practically, and I walk up to them and I like say good morning, or whatever, in sign language to them, and she like looks and is a little surprised because American guy probably, and all of a sudden I'm just like, good morning, how are you, or whatever, and she looks down at my name tag and sees that it's Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, and she seriously like goes like this, like and like she starts like spitting like Xing at me, and I was like, what the, and she was seriously so mean, like I was like legit that I like she was like making these noises at me, and I was so bothered, and I feel a little bit bad that I was just like I got a little frustrated where I was just like, hey. In English out loud, so like 0 for 2.
That's gonna be helpful.
Well, listen, because she couldn't hear it, and it was in English, so it was just like 0 for 2. And I was just like, hey, I was just trying to be nice. Like I legit was just saying good morning, and just because like, and I remember getting on the subway and just thinking like, what, like why, like what? Just because I had this name tag on, like she assumes like the very, very worst about like. Anyways, it just was like so like demeaning and frustrated, and I just like and it wasn't even that bad. And just imagine that's like the place that he is in, and so it made me want to study chapter 8 in this context of moments of discouragement, or when you want to give up, or when you feel overwhelmed, and just to see what happens in this chapter for those times when you just want to give up. And here's just a couple of things that I found in the chapter that I think you might want to mark. And I made a little slide for it here so that it might be easier to like screenshot that, or remember these are always in the app, the PDFs of the lessons are in there. But in times of discouragement, I love in verse 1 that he goes home to Zarahemla, and he returned to his own house to rest himself from the labors which he had performed. And just how important that is in a life that can be filled with discouragement, that we have a place that we can go back to kind of recenter and remember the things that are important, to go home. And for some of us, that really is our home. And for others, that would be like in our scriptures, or that would be in the temple, or in a congregation of believers. Just a place where you're just like, I have to go back home.
Well, and I think it's interesting because I think there's this funny connotation with going home that means you like really did give up, or you failed, per se. And I love that that's the beginning of this story, not the end of it.
Cool.
And when he went home, he didn't go because he failed or he had given up or because it was the worst possible. Like, you know what I'm saying? That wasn't the end of his story, but rather he went home because he needed to be lifted back up.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good reminder that when you see people like that are like, wait, that you might gut instinctually think, oh, they gave up. They were too weak, like fill in the blank of like, oh, why are they doing that? And rather than just being angry at them for going home, maybe you should think in your head like, wait, maybe they need some lifting up right now.
Yeah.
Maybe they need to be boosted.
Yeah.
A little break. That's not the end of the story. In fact, it's just the beginning.
Right. So important. I like that he goes to this. This is before he gets like the part, but I think it is a lesson in what to do.
Why is that? Why do I wish that I could just watch you in that moment?
Well, one day I'm going to show you.
With your English.
But he goes to this other city called Melech, and he had a great experience there. I just love in verse 5 where it says this about his teaching. It came to pass that the people came to him throughout all the borders of the land, which was by the wilderness side. And one of the things I think that we can learn in those times of discouragement is how important it is to reach out. And I just particularly love how far Alma's reach is. That his words and encouragement and teaching reach the people on the borders and in the margins. Those that are practically on the wilderness side. I learned something from a preacher that I admire so much, where he said this advice once. He was like, teach and preach to the people that you wish were there. And then they'll feel comfortable when they come. And I just feel like a little side lesson there, but Alma reaches out. You find out in verse 10 that he labors in spirit, wrestling with God in mighty prayer. That take that like Enos does before the Lord, your wrestles, your concerns, your discouragement in that mighty prayer. Pour out is a phrase that's used in verse 10 as well. Verse 13, I thought I put up on this board, just know, because people reviled him, they spit on him, they cast him out of their city. And there's so many narratives that Alma could tell himself at that point for why this wasn't working out. It must be me. I must not be good enough. I must not be faithful enough. I'm failing at my calling. And I think it's important just to know that it's a fight. It's a battle, right? Like you were saying, for the hearts of people. And so discouragement is part of a disciple's journey. Discouragement is a part of all of our journeys. It's kind of then, what do you do with it? But the existence of discouragement does not mean, or failure doesn't mean you're an ultimate failure. And I just think that's important to know. That it's like this is just part of it. And if you need evidence of that, like remind yourself how often Jesus was rejected and his message was rejected. Like he was God himself on earth. And it's just, for some reason, it's just helpful to like recenter and know that. Then an angel comes, and of all the angels God could have sent, he sent the angel who first came to him and his buddies when they were just making a ruckus. And there's something sweet and tender about that. There are like millions of angels to choose from up there. And I just think it's so tender that God sends that angel who first came to him with this angelic message in 15. Blessed art thou, Alma. Lift up your head and rejoice, for you have great cause to rejoice. You've been faithful in keeping the commandments of God from the very first time that you received them. And by the way, I am he who delivered them unto you. You probably don't recognize me because you were flat on your back when I came and you were kind of scared. But I just want you to know it's me, and I'm so proud of what you've been doing. And there is reason that you have to lift up your head and rejoice.
Well, and I love that the angel that came was one that could look and say, oh my goodness, for real, do you realize how incredible this is?
Yeah.
That even what you might see as a failure, if you, however many years ago saw, or whatever, however long ago it was, I have no idea, I just made that up in my head, but however long ago it was, if you could see
what
yourself
was gonna
now,
happen. Yeah.
like you would never have believed it. And he's like, that's what I'm seeing. That's why I'm so proud, is because I will always show up for you in the moments that you need me.
Yeah.
But also I will remind you that you are doing so much better than you ever could believe.
So cool. And so I just think that's part of it. Like, look for heaven's encouragement. Listen for heaven's encouragement.
And that heaven will send you exactly who you need.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah. And sometimes that can be in a blessing, a patriarchal blessing that you can go back and read, like words of a song, impressions in the heart. There's so many ways that heaven can encourage. He tells them, go back. Go back to the city, return back to it. And I love in verse 18, he goes speedily to the land of Ammonihah. He's like, all right. And sometimes that's all you need to just like, who wants to run back to that city that treats you so dirty, But he goes back speedily. And I do love that he goes in another way. Sometimes when we're discouraged, like some good practical advice is, how about you try another way? If it didn't work this way, that's not the only way that you can maybe your method, is off. And so he goes back in and then meets this man whose name is Amulek. And it's awesome because he just walks up to him on the street. And when he walks up to him on the street, he realizes that God's been orchestrating something long before he got there. And the man says, I'm a Nephite, and I know that you're a holy prophet because an angel came to me and said that you would show up, and he told me to take care of you. And I know you're going to be a blessing to my house, so please come. And he brings him into his house. And that's another thing I wrote there too, is look for God sends, particularly in people. That God will put people in your moments of discouragement. He's going to send Amuleks. And he might send the kind of people that you didn't expect that he would send. Because when you find out Amulek's story a little bit later, you're sort of like, oh my gosh, I thought that you were going to send the Elders Quorum president. And in fact, he sends someone like wildly off his radar. And he becomes they're going to become such great friends and companions from this. And I just watch for those godsends in your moments of discouragement. Verse 22 is my practical one, which is you should just eat and be filled.
That's so on brand for me. That is so on brand for me.
It really is. Like I can remember talking with this lady as a bishop, and like she had she just lost her job or whatever, and I thought, you know what? I ordered her a pizza. I told her, you go home, eat this in your bed, and tomorrow let's start tackling finding a new job. But for tonight, eat a good meal. Yeah. People are like, pizza ain't a good meal. I'm just like, I know, but it was her favorite. It was her favorite. But there's something about that. Be filled. Like there are, what those things are that fill you up. And they some of them are spiritual, but some of them are just like, it could like a walk in the park or a lunch with a friend.
And that gets to be spiritual too.
Yeah,
if that's what you need, that gets to be spiritual too.
Just reminds me of that story of Elijah when he wants to give up. Remember? And the angel comes with a cake and he's like, have a cake.
And a nap.
Which is my very next one, which is in verse 27. I just love that he just like, the angel says, go back, and he goes back. And then he says to him, then in verse 27 it says, they tarried many days there with Amulek before he began to preach. They're just like, take a minute to get yourself ready, kind of gear up again, have a rest, have a nap. And I think that is so sweet. And then in verse 32, he just says, and they went forth and began to preach and prophesy according to the spirit and power which the Lord had given them. And I think it is just a beautiful thing to expect spirit and expect power to be given to you in those moments of discouragement as well. Can I just share one last little side story, which is really cool about Amulek, because we just are meeting him and it's just so awesome. I noticed this today while reading that when he comes to his house, he is sent by this angel to go take care of this man. Take care of him. That was the instructions. And so he finds him on the street and he takes care of him. And then after feeding him and giving him a place to be in his home, Alma introduces himself in verse 23. And he says, I am Alma. I'm the high priest over the church of God throughout the land. And you're sort of like, I was like, what? He had no idea who he was.
Yeah, you would think that you would lead with that when you're like looking for a place to stay. Yeah. Like you're like, oh, by the way, I'm kind of like a...
Yeah, so it's kind of sweet that Alma doesn't say it. And also I think it's sweet that Amulek has no clue who he is. So he's not taking care of him because he's the president of the church. He's just taking care of him because an angel gave him the commission to. So go take care of this man when you find him. And he's like, okay.
He says, sure, whatever you say.
Whoever he is. It just reminds me of that story. Do you remember when Christian was in Salt Lake and he's at McDonald's and there is this nice old man in line with him? Some of you have heard this story. I've told it on here before, but there's this nice old man in line with him. And so he looks at him and he's like, oh man, I bet he would just like some friends. So he invites him to come and share fries. That's all the money they had for was French fries. Share French fries.
And can we pause? Because the best part is that they didn't even get him his own. Like it's like a share. Sit down. Here, have some more.
So they share French fries at the table, and they're just chatting about basketball because they were at a basketball tournament, and he's like, I used to play basketball, and they're like, oh, it's awesome. And he offered them some cookies from his Tupperware that he had, and they were just having this grand old time. And then then he sees his family. He's like, oh, my family came, so I'm just going to leave y'all. And he's like, okay, well, have a good day. And he leaves and he goes over, to another table. And then one of Christian's friends is like, you guys, I think that's Elder Oaks, or President Oaks. And Christian goes, is that your bishop?
That's not
No, I promise we watch conference. But he said, is that your bishop? And he was just like, no, he speaks in conference. And so they like look up his pic, and they're like, oh my gosh, that really is.
Is that your bishop? Is killing me.
It's like, it really was him. And then the cutest part is that afterwards, Christian on the way out, like walked up to him and was like, hey, I really like your talks, and walks out, which is so sweet. But that moment when he told me that story was so sweet to me, because it was such a moment of encouragement, for a Christian, maybe a moment of encouragement for President Oaks as well. And I just thought of what a, sweet kind of experience something like that could be. He didn't know who he was, but they still became a blessing into each other's lives. And just a reminder to me of just this, what it means and the beauty of living in a community of faith. That it's just like, that with each person waking up each morning, listening for an angelic commission to take care of somebody else, and the miracles and the sweet experiences that God can orchestrate in a community like that. Because life is so lifey, as I said the other day, right? It just can be so discouraging. And just to know, like, but there is help and encouragement in all of that. So, anyways, a really cool chapter.
Yeah.
And I think you could give that chapter to somebody and say, what advice do you find in here for the times that you want to give up? Like, where do you hear and see God's whisper through people and experiences and tender coincidences? Where do you hear him saying, don't give up? Right?
Even
Keep
I think it'd be
going.
so cool to walk through this whole story like this and then just pause after every single one and say, okay, like, when have you done this? When have you experienced this? When have you seen it?
Yeah.
Like, bring it to life.
Yeah.
I think it'd be so cool.
And then it arms you also with a lot of advice for when you encounter somebody who's feeling discouraged.
For sure.
As well. So,
For sure.
It's a cool chapter.
The next chapter, chapter 9, is kind of the beginning of Alma and Amulek teaching. And Alma's going to kind of start, that's like how this like chapter kind of goes forward. And it's so interesting because as they begin, the people they're talking to in Ammonihah ask 2 questions that I think are fascinating. And you can read them and they might have a little bit of attitude when you read them first. But I kind of wonder if maybe it was a little bit more genuine than we think it was when we initially read. And what happens is they begin teaching, and instantly in verse 2, the first question comes. And it's just so simple. Who are you? Who are you that you're going to tell me how to live my life? Who are you that you're going to change the way I think? Who are you that you're going to tell me that I'm doing something wrong? Because these type of conversations come in a much better and holier way if it is not a stranger. If it's someone that you look to and you say, okay, you have grounds to stand on to talk to me about where I am. And sometimes that comes with authority given to you, like a missionary name tag or a calling or something like that like you'll say, okay, yeah, that makes sense. This is your job right now to do this. That's who you are right now. I will listen. But I also think that there's a level of maybe before you even begin these conversations to sit down and say, who am I to them? And if I am coming at them as a stranger, then maybe this conversation isn't going to go the way I want it to. And maybe there needs to be a relationship before this conversation begins.
Yeah, and even that question could have been Alma's question to them, right? They asked him, who are you? And good advice to Alma might be, maybe you should have maybe some good advice is you could have began with that question for them. Hey, tell me about who y'all are.
Yeah. This is going to be a better conversation if we are not strangers to each other.
Yeah.
And then what's going to happen is there's another question that comes in verse number 6. And it kind of plays along the same idea of strangers because this time they ask, who is God? Who is this God that's going to send no more authority than one man among this people? They start asking these questions. It's a longer question, but I think that the first 3 words embody the whole thing. Who is God? Because why are you going to tell me to live my life differently for him if he is a stranger? And why will I listen to you if you're one? And I think it's so interesting that this is a people that really might feel like God is a stranger to them. But the conversation that Alma has with these people afterwards is not talking to them like they think God is a stranger. And I think there are moments in our lives when we think that God is a stranger, when in reality, we might just need a reminder.
Yeah.
And we might know him better than we think we do. Because what happens is they stand there and they're like, okay, you don't really think, like, you're confused about who we are, who God is. We're going to have to start at the very basis of things. And it's so interesting because what he says in verse number 9 isn't, let me introduce God to you. It's, do you not remember? Did you forget that you might have known God all along and just accidentally forgot? And he's going to go through and he's going to say, listen, do you not remember that, like, who led you through the wilderness? Do you not remember his matchless power and his mercy and his long suffering to us? Because this is your story. You lived this. Mm-hmm. And you might feel like God is a stranger right now, but he wasn't always.
And this is kind of cool. I was just thinking this, like, here's like, do you understand that the land you're living in is a result of a miracle? Is an answer to a prayer for deliverance. Like, you're here on this very soil because of the deliverance of God. Like, that happened before you ever got here, but it's just kind of neat to just be like, you're living.
You're evidence,
yeah,
whether
like
you know it or not.
the ground you're standing on is evidence of a God who delivers.
Yes.
It's kind of cool.
Way cool. And I think it's important to realize at the beginning of this chapter that those two questions might have been asked with a little bit more attitude when you read the whole verse, and maybe they weren't, and who's to say? But I think that they are very valid questions, whether or not they were asked with attitude. And I think something that's so fascinating is the response. Not, why don't you know God? Not, oh my goodness, let me introduce and tell you every single thing that I could think about who God is. But rather, once he talks to them about repentance, he's going to go through, and starting in verse 20, he's going to start saying all of these afters and have-beens. And it's going to be this moment that he's like, let me jolt your memory. Let me remind you that God might not be as stranger to you as you think he is. And he says, listen, you have been such a highly favored people of the Lord. You have been favored above so many other things. Verse 21, you've been visited by the Spirit of God and you've conversed with angels. You've been spoken to by the voice of the Lord. You've received revelation. You've had prophecy. You've had gifts, the gifts of tongues, the gift of preaching. In verse 22, you've been delivered time and time again by the very hand of God. You've been saved from him. You've been protected by him. You have been kept and preserved by him. Like this, I think verse number 23 is so good. You have received so many great blessings by God. And you might know him better than you think you did. You just might not have recognized that it has been God the whole time. And I think that in these moments when we feel like God is such a stranger, maybe we just need to take a second and look at our story and see if maybe there are moments that God has been closer than we thought. That maybe he has showed up in a relationship with us in ways that we didn't originally see, and we just need a reminder that God has been there, that we know him better than we think we do.
Yeah, and it's just making me think how we talked about the heart, and I believe one of the quickest ways to the heart is gratitude. Yeah, and I know that sounds like super cliche, but I just think Alma understands that about people. He understands that because of his own experiences, right? And I just think that he's help someone remember who God has been to you and who God has been in your past is a great way to start cracking a shell over a heart. And I think that's really, really just important, I think, to know for ourselves and if we're ever called or inspired to try and help somebody else. Yeah. And that's why this word for our week is so awesome, because it's this idea of remembering. And like you taught last week, reflection is a great way to help somebody develop a sense of gratitude. I can remember at the end of an HXP trip. Grace and I both work with HXP, which is takes humanitarian trips for teenagers around the world. We're about to, this summer, it's going to be experiencing that again. So we'll come back in the fall with more stories of those. But at the end of one of those trips, we just took some time to reflect and remember where we saw the hand of God over that trip. And I just remember being so overwhelmed with with a thankful heart for what God not only did on that trip, but for years before that. And it just made my heart so tender. Like it just tendered it right up. And I think just became a soft landing place for more inspiration and more direction. And so anyways, I just think that's beautiful Alma's doing here. And it's just such a good reminder.
And on one of those same trips, well, I was in a different country, but I remember sitting there and it was one of our last nights. And it was so interesting because everyone was saying their favorite part of the trip. And then this one boy went and he was a pretty, not super invested in spiritual things on the entire trip. And he just got so teary-eyed and he's like, oh, I think I finally figured out what we were doing here. And I was like, oh, okay, perfect. What? Because we were building a house, but it's fine, no problem. Yeah. And he just said, we're just meeting God in Costa Rica.
Oh my gosh.
And that came not in the middle of the trip, but at the end looking back.
Yeah.
And you might realize after the experiences that you already had met God. But maybe you just need a second to look back and realize.
Yeah, I'm marking. Well, I'm trying to pick between two paths here.
It's fine.
Right,
it's
one,
fine.
I want to read on this, the Webster's Dictionary. Let's start with that because look at what that word remember means. Mm-hmm. To attend to meditate, to bear or keep in mind. I think this is interesting, this meditate, and then the next line, to think of and consider.
Yeah.
Like sometimes memories pop in your mind and you remember, but remember can also be more of an action verb instead of this passive, oh my gosh, I just remembered, but rather to take time to remember is what Alma seems to be introducing these people. Don't you remember? Stop and consider. Bear in mind with esteem, praise. Remembering can be a form of praise. It can be a form of admiration, of care, confidence, to keep something as sacred. This is such an awesome, to celebrate, to trust with reverence or regard. Those are such a powerful definition of what remembering can do. And I know we talk a lot about that, the importance of remembrance. That's top 5 conversations in Sunday school classes across the church.
Well,
right?
and I would say themes in the Book of Mormon.
Right.
I feel even within the past 5 lessons, that's been all over the whole, all over the pages.
But I love how this expands what a worshipful experience remembering can be. Beautiful. And it's going to come up again, everybody. That will be our promise. And I think that verse 26 was one of my favorite verses in chapter 9, that you get a chance to remember those attributes and characteristics of God. And maybe that's what that boy discovered. He's like, we met God, and I learned that he was fill in the blank, while I was here. And he'll always have that memory that he could look back to. And it's there I learned that he was 26. Maybe he learned he was full of grace and truth and patience and mercy and long suffering and all of those things. So what's cool is Alma finishes preaching and then Amulek, it sort of is tag team. Amulek takes over, which I think it's really interesting. You started by talking about who are you? Because Amulek introduces himself and he tells this story. I'm the son of Giddy someone, who was the son of Ishmael, who is a descendant of Aminadabi, who interpreted the writing on the wall of the temple written by the finger of God, which there's no source for that story anywhere currently in the scriptures of planet Earth, And so you're kind of what? But I was just thinking while you were teaching, because I read that earlier and I wrote who's that? This Aminadabi fellow. And the interesting thing is, none of us know who that is, but everyone listening to him did know who it was. And what a valuable asset Amulek is, because he's one of the people. He's just you guys, he can talk the language of Ammonihah. And it just makes me really interested in the fact that we do have called and authorized by the Lord people, but prophets, seers, revelators, leaders. But then how awesome it is that we also have those who are just the regulars. Yeah. And they would argue with me and say, we're regular too. We were just endowed with a special calling. It's I know. But working together, it makes them such a great companionship. Because you have the official church, which does so many good things as the official church. But you also have just the neighbors down the street who are doing as much good because of the access that they have to people's hearts, because I know your stories. I know what's going on here. Like sometimes you can be reached by, the official church and the leadership of the church.
Yeah.
And sometimes you can be reached by someone next door. And it's this companionship is like, it gives me life and it gives me encouragement to just be a regular guy and have a role to play, even if I'm not currently holding a particular like calling at the time. Which I think this companionship's so awesome. And he begins to teach, and he tells his story a little bit, and his story is really awesome because he says, he introduced himself. I've got no small reputation, verse 4. I've got a lot of money and a lot of friends here. I've been around the block. I know industry. I know all of these things. And he's like, but let me tell you about this spiritual side of me that you might not know. He says, even after all the success I've had, I haven't known much of the ways of the Lord before, or his mysteries, or his marvelous power. I said I've never known much of these things, but I'm kind of mistaken, for I've seen so much of his mysteries and his marvelous power and the preservation of the lives of this people.
Which I think is so cool because it almost feels like he was getting affected by what Alma was saying the chapter before as well.
I was just thinking that same thing.
It's like almost he had this moment that he's like, wait, I'm learning in the exact same way you are. That I might not have realized the whole entire time, but when I look back, I realize that I know God better than I thought I did.
Yeah. And he's like, because, listen, I hardened my heart. Looking back, I know that's what I was doing. Because at the time, he says, I was called many times and I would not hear. Therefore, I knew concerning these things, yet I would not know. I knew, but I would not know. And now looking back, reflecting on that, being honest with myself, I realized, God did call many times. And I knew he was calling, but I just didn't want to know for whatever reason that was. It reminds me of two quotes that I love so much in companionship with each other. One is by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who's this poem you may have heard before. She says, all of earth is crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. Everyone else sits around it and plucks blackberries. And it's in reference to the story of Moses on Mount Sinai, where a common bush was afire with God. And everyone's life changed because of that experience with this common place and this common man. But God came into that story, and she says all of earth is like that. It's crammed with heaven. And all these common places are afire with God, but only to those people who notice. Everyone else could sit around the very holiest of experiences and the holiest of people and just pluck blackberries. They don't see. And maybe it's because they don't want to see. And he's talking about that feeling, and he says, I was called many times and I wouldn't know. And he says, and I was going on rebelling against God in the wickedness of my heart until the 4th day of the 7th month. And I love that is the 4th of July, friends, because, and don't tell me it's the Nephite calendar or anything like this, because let me have it be the 4th of July. It's Independence Day.
But also, do you know what I love? Is that I love that he remembers the day.
The very day.
He's like, no, that was special enough to me that I will not forget that day. You only remember the most important days, anniversaries, birthdays, and I love to him that was a day worth remembering.
Yeah, and he says, that was the day an angel tapped me on the shoulder. And that's the other quote I wanted to tell you. It's Winston Churchill, who said this line, there comes a day. I'm just like quoting it as I'm pulling it up really slowly, dramatically. Now I have it. To each there comes in their lifetime a special moment when they're figuratively tapped on the shoulder and offered the chance to do a very special thing, unique to them and fitted to their talents. What a tragedy if that moment finds them unprepared or unqualified for that which could have been their finest hour. And I think the only thing that would have unqualified Amulek from this moment that leads to some of his finest hours is simply by ignoring the invitation. Like if you read his resume, you would have said you were unfit to be tapped on the shoulder, but God tapped him. And now there was this moment of decision. And he says in verse 8, it came to pass, I obeyed. And that was the turning point. The tap came on the shoulder from heaven, and he decided right then and there, I'm going to obey. And I love thinking about that and anticipating a tap on the shoulder from heaven and listening for those and just being ready to obey whatever it is they may be. And he does, and everything changes. And he talks about this, Alma coming into his house. And he says, this is what's so sweet about this. It was like in verse 10, I know the things which he testified of are true. Let me tell you how I knew. For behold, I say unto you, as the Lord liveth, even so he sent his angel to make these things manifest unto me. And this he has done while this Alma hath dwelt in my house. I think there's something really interesting that we see in other spots of Scripture, that he brings them into his house first. An invitation came. He obeyed the invitation. And then he says that angel manifested the truthfulness of who he was. Like he told him in his mind, this is a holy man. But then when he brought him into his house, he felt it in his heart. And that might be a pattern for all of us. Like someone gives us an invitation to our thoughts and to our minds. But then when we follow through with them, that's when that is manifested to our hearts. And we experience it and feel it and know it for ourselves. And that's the basis of his witness. And he says, the blessing of the Lord rested upon us. Like we experienced it. When we brought him in, we experienced it. And I love just thinking about, and maybe the question of asking, like, in addition to like these tapping moments that people may have had, like maybe someone's got a cool story about that, their 4th of July, right? But also to just think about what are the different ways I can bring the prophet in, and the promises and the blessings and the words of the Lord through prophets, I should say, into our home, that they can rest upon our homes and our lives, and we can experience that. And what a mighty difference like it will make. I was just telling Grace before we started that one Christmas my mom gave us all a picture, and just a little framed picture for everybody. And it was a picture of her sitting just right next to President Spencer W. Kimball. And with it was the story where she, growing up, kind of lived in a family of mixed faith between her two parents, and not necessarily front of the ensign, kind of family or whatever. And one day President Kimball came down to Houston and asked to visit a home. He wanted to visit a home, and her home was chosen. And in that testimony that she printed up for everyone, she said, I knew the moment he walked in that there was something different about him. And he played a little song for her on the piano, and they talked of the regular things and also the spiritual things. And a blessing rested on that house, and a blessing rested on the heart of my mom. And that has had a generational impact. We're now on a third and someday soon, maybe a fourth generation of those who are benefiting from a blessing that rested on that house, a witness that came into hearts when somebody said yes to bringing him in. And that's our tender mercy for a day. Just particularly a blessing on houses, but particularly the blessing that the words of the Lord delivered through holy messengers can be for us. Like it's one other avenue that we have where God can bless and speak and give promise to us today. And I think that's just like so awesome. I wrote that book, like one of the first books I wrote, Almighty, about like different ways that God shows love. And ever since I published it, I always wished I'd put a chapter in it about prophets as one of the ways that God shows love. So maybe I'll write a little addendum or something.
You do a little like pamphlet.
Maybe I just made up for it right now. But anyways.
The next little part of this chapter is really just him talking to the people. And there's one part that I think wins me over more than the rest. And he's going to go through and you can find a lot of good things. But mostly he's talking about the disaster that this people has become and the mess that they found themselves in. But there's one little part that just speaks hope. And he says this in verse number 22. Yea, and I say unto you that if it were not for the prayers of the righteous, who are now in the land, that you would even now be visited with utter destruction. And I think like it's like actually crazy. And he goes through and it says, and it's not going to be a flood like Noah's days, like that's not going to be it, but it would be by famine and by pestilence and by the sword. He's going to go into specifics and say, listen, you would not be here if it were not for the people who are praying for you. You would not be here without the prayers of the righteous. And he repeats it again in verse 23. But it is by the prayers of the righteous that you are spared. And it's so interesting to me because in chapter 9, at the very beginning, that you didn't even like, that feels like a million years ago. Sorry, we're going back. Surprise. What happens is it's in the middle of Alma giving up and him having this really difficult moment that he's like, I can't do this anymore. This is a real disaster. And David mentioned this in verse number 10, that he labors much in the spirit, wrestling with God in mighty prayer.
Oh, back in 8.
Oh, yeah, 8.
Okay,
Sorry,
yeah.
I just lied to you. Back in 8. And he's praying so hard for the people. And what is so fascinating to me, you would think that the answer would be like, and so it worked, and all the people loved him, and it's going to be perfect. But what happens in verse number 11 is that you see the word nevertheless, which we usually use as like a hopeful word. But in this moment, it's not nevertheless. They hardened their hearts. And I think it's so interesting that Alma probably thought his prayers were failing. Alma probably thought his prayers were not being answered, that things were falling apart and getting harder and messier, and it was a big disaster. But in all reality, just 3 chapters later, or 2 chapters, I'm terrible at math, it's fine, everyone. You get the answer that maybe his prayer was being answered in a way that Alma never expected. And though he couldn't see the fruits of his prayer or the immediate blessings of the prayer, or maybe the prayer didn't get answered in the way that he was hoping that it would, his prayer was still saving people. Countless people. And I think that there's a lesson in realizing that your prayers might be more powerful than you thought.
Yeah.
Even the prayers that you didn't think were getting answered,
Yeah.
God is saving people with.
Yeah.
And don't give up. Your prayers are way more significant than you could ever imagine.
Yeah. And it's really the most, it's wild because the simplicity of prayer leads you to believe that it wouldn't have the kind of impact that it does.
Yeah.
And so sometimes the simplicity becomes a stumbling block.
Yes.
But perhaps we can just think about, instead of with that kind of mindset, what we're doing is putting it too much on ourselves. And we're saying, oh, I'm not doing enough. But if we can imagine prayer as the work of God, then we realize, oh, my part is simple, but he's doing a mighty work in the equation. Does that make sense?
Yes.
If I'm thinking no, prayer's too simple, I'm not going to do it. I'm just oh, you must think that you're the one
Who's
taking care of the work. But if you can switch that script and realize the simplicity of prayer actually teaches us about how liberally gracious God is with his power. That he's yeah, exactly. All you have to do is strike the match.
Yeah.
And watch what I can do.
Yeah.
You know, if we can just switch that mindset a little bit, maybe we'll pray more often as we realize what prayer is handing it over, to him.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Anyways, I want to word that a little bit better. I'm
no,
on
that was really good.
there.
That was really good. I think you worded it good.
That I'm learning in the moment.
I legit was thinking in my head. I was and what I think is so cool is that changes the way that I want to pray, and not even just the simplicity of my prayers, perhaps, but even the language which I speak to God. That when you realize that you are truly speaking with someone who has all-knowing wisdom and all-powerful, it might change the way you talk to him.
Yeah. Which is just preposterous that he's invited us into relationship and conversation with him.
Yeah.
I just am having a moment here of my word.
That really is crazy. Why is it?
Right. Why have you invited me into the throne room so easily?
Yes. That I could just do it. I could just get on my knees wherever I am. I could even in my car.
Right. This is actually one of the reasons I really appreciate the way that I've learned about prayer from my Muslim brothers and sisters. That before they pray, they'll wash their hands and they wash their face and they wash their feet and they'll change their clothes and they'll they make sure that full prostration, like all the way down to the ground, is part of the prayer. And I was talking to this friend of mine who's Muslim, and he was saying, oh, that's because we're entering into the presence of God.
Wow.
And so I want to, and I think both of those principles together at the same time would be really valuable to understand.
Yeah.
I can be driving down I-15 and I can walk into the throne room, and that's remarkable. But then also to let your heart be swayed by you're also walking into the throne room. So, I want both to have full sway on my heart.
Because that's what I was thinking is I was like, when you were talking, I was like, oh, I kind of want to change the way I pray. I want to use better language. Like, I want to use appropriate language for the person that I'm speaking to.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it's not me. I'm not doing the work here.
Right.
It's God.
Right.
Like, that's such an interesting thing. Like, that was like a humbling moment for me. Anyways, so.
Yeah.
That was
Anyways,
good.
there's more
good thing that we just learned really
There's more to unpack here. Prayer will come up again. So we can maybe unpack it as we get there. Now, 11 and 12 we're just kind of, getting to the end of this here. And you're going to say, but 11 and 12. And I know this is on purpose because 11 and 12, we want you to spend in, this is where I want you to spend a lot of time in your study. And maybe in your discussions with people. Mm-hmm. And it really introduces this idea and this concept at the beginning of 11, and then it's our worksheet also, so we'll show you maybe a great way to study this and lead this into some sort of discussion. But we meet this fellow in 11 named Zeezrom, and he's going to become a long-standing friend in the Book of Mormon. So get to know him and make room for him. And he is a lawyer, part of the judge system of the Book of Mormon. And chapter 11 starts with this explanation about how the system of lawyers and judges work, that they get paid by the hour, essentially. So the more business they drum up, the more money that they're going to make. And so the more contention or more arguments that they can drum up, the more chance for business. And so you sort of get some intention here from people where you're just like, which I think is interesting to learn the intention of people, which is sometimes hard, but we're learning it here. And they give like this long column about like money, and like and I think it's interesting. Like, there's this long column about the explanation of the money here, and there's probably some other reasons that it is in there. But I think one of the reasons that it might be in there is because all societies, past, present, and future, are going to have an obsession with money. Money is going to have a sway on a heart. Yeah. It's like so much so that we're going to spend a whole column with, I don't even care. Does somebody want me to explain to you? It's like 2 dimes make a nickel.
Which makes it so funny because
I just did it backwards.
To us, it's fine. To us, that matters so much.
I know.
Thinking about them in however many years. We think that rules our world, how much $1 is worth. Yeah. And I'm like, and now we skip over it. Yeah. I think it's the most boring thing ever.
It's so dumb. And you can see that it's just like, that there is like this. And Zeezrom actually tries to use money to get Amulek to deny and Alma to deny the testimonies and the witnesses which they have. Essentially, he says, you can buy anything in this world with money, is something he says to them. And see if you will just deny that thing. And I think you learn the intention of the devil, speaking of intentions 21, to destroy that which was good. That's his intention. That's his end goal. There might be 4 steps before he does get to that, but that's where he's headed, and that's what he's trying to do. And there's some great teaching principles in this column of 21 through 25. But Zeezrom starts questioning Amulek. I love how confident Amulek is in this, where he's just like, you're new. Bro.
Yes.
You're new.
Yes.
And he is just so confident. And his confidence comes from verse 22. I just won't say that which is contrary to the Spirit of the Lord. And as a new missionary, he finds so much confidence in that. Send this to every new missionary that you know and let them find confidence in, I'm going to just do nothing that is contrary to the Spirit of the Lord. And I'm going to tell you what I believe and what I know. And it's really simple truths. Now, let me set this up. Zeezrom really tries to like trick him with questioning. And he's like, do you believe there's a true and living God? And he's just like, yes, I believe that. Is there more than one God? And he says, no. And he says, how do you know? And he's an angel told me. Who then what God's going to come? Is it the Son of God or God? And he says, yes. And he's like, will he save people in their sins? And he's like, he won't save people in their sins, but he's going to save them from their sins. And he's like, gotcha. And I just think this is so interesting that Zeezrom is going to get so caught up in the difference between saving someone in their sins and saving someone from their sins. Now, Amalek's going to explain to him what he means by that, and which is great. But I'm intrigued by the fact that Zeezrom is so caught up in the difference between, is there one God or whatever? Is it in your sins or from your sins? And he's just so like, gotcha. When I just want to say like, okay, great. We can talk about those things, but you are missing it, Zeezrom. You're missing it. You're missing. If you want to take a pie chart of Christianity, you're playing in the 0.5% of the sandbox. And you're missing the overwhelming, thrilling truths of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Because you're so caught up in these little nitty-gritty things because you're just trying to trip us up. Like you don't even care to learn, but really? You're going to spend your time and your mental effort, so much of it. I'm not saying there's not room to like discuss and ask questions and these kind of things, but his whole emphasis is, one, in destroying that which is good by getting caught up in the nitty-gritty of things. And I like that over the next 2 chapters, and this is what we'd love for you to do with this, is an emphasis on don't miss the point. Don't miss the beautiful, overwhelming, wonderful truths of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So we have the worksheet, which I want to kind of suggest. Remember, these also come in the newsletter. So you can print a small version of this because this would be awesome to put 1 in 11. And if you need more room, put 1 in 11 and 1 in 12 as an extra little tip in. Because the worksheet says these are truths that are worth more than money. Because Zeezrom offers him money and he says, hey, how about I pay you this to deny that? And he's like, I don't think you understand what I have. No, bad deal, dude. Not with what I know. And so I just started listing them here. And then in 11 and also 12, you can go through and just, what are the truths that are more valuable than money? Let me mention a few, and then Grace is going to mention a couple from chapter 12. I like in 11 that he says that he will come and redeem his people. I'm so moved by this line right now. He will take on him the sins of his people. There's something about that phrase that's just hitting my heart differently today, where he just says, I will take that burden on me. Like, you've had the burden of your sins on you. Let me take that problem. Let me handle that. Let me take that off your plate. Just the fact that someone was willing to do that he would come into the world. Christianity is a message of not what we need to do to get to God, but that what God was willing to do to get to us. And that's what we're learning here. Get swallowed up in that truth. Is what he's saying. That he will break the bonds of death. That terrible enemy of this world that's caused so many tears and so much heartache. And he says, that's not the end of people's stories because of what he came to do. Every funeral you've been to, every grave you've stood over is not the end of people's stories because of the sacrifice of the Son of God. And you want to get caught up in your sins, from your sins? Great. But you're missing the thrill and the wonder of what the gospel of Jesus Christ is all about. It's worth more than any of your dumb Sions.
You would choose that
whatever.
Over any of that every day.
Give me any amount of Amnor, eggs on ties, whatever. I'm not taking it. I'm not trading it. I'm not trading it to see my grandma again. I'm not trading it to watch what happens when, like, friends that have lost, children, to see them again. Watch the healing of the heart. But no amount of money is going to be worth that. No amount of money is going to be worth, like, watching, I was talking to a friend just yesterday whose mother is deaf. And she was telling me that her mom said to her one day you're going to hear me sing to Jesus, because she's never heard that before, And it's like, How much do you think you can pay me, to trade for something like that? So that's just some in 11. And now, I set you up like that's only what I don't know what you're going to say.
No, well, that's exactly it. And what happens is now this is going to be Alma's moment. And I think it's really cool that though they are speaking about similar things, it's also very unique and personal. And I think it's one of those moments that you realize that we all can connect to very different things about who God is.
Really cool. That's really cool.
This is the same conversation, but these two people are going to say very different things about what is worth more than gold to them about God.
And that's what I just want to say, maybe you're going to go here, is what makes this such a valuable discussion. Because please study it on your own and find the truths more valuable than gold to you. But my word, because it's going to be so different.
Yes.
Depending on who somebody is, like let other people give theirs as well.
Well, and what a cool lesson, even if you just flip to the worksheet on the back. Or I guess you can't because it's the next week's page, but the page before that.
Oh, yeah, well, you print it out.
Yeah, or print it out.
Yeah.
I think that would be so cool to say, okay, find all of Amulek's, find all of Alma's, and then find yours.
Or just
what
get a really
say?
little pen in your journal. It's going to be fine too.
It's fine.
Yeah.
You can just find a space. You can find a space. It's no worries. And what starts to happen is Yezrom actually begins to have this moment that he's like, wait, this is more than what I expected it to be. And in verse number 7, you hear him say, now when Alma had spoken these words, Yezrom began to tremble more exceedingly, for he was convinced more and more of the power of God. And I love that this is a more and more type of moment. That he is not it's not just this one single sentence that he's like, oh yeah, this is it. But really his heart is getting tiny bit won over, tiny bit won over, tiny bit won over, a little and a little and a little. And I think that's more true for all of us than anything else.
I was just thinking that same thing.
That it really is just a more and more and more and more. And I think that would be a really cool thing to look through if you want a different perspective of this chapter, is to just look through chapter 12 and think what would convince me more? What is my more and more and more that Alma's going to say that will win my heart a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more? And it's not just one of those things, but it is the fact that all of them are true. Not just Alma's, but Amulek's, and whatever you write down on your paper, that is more and more and more, and you don't have to choose just one. That's the thing about our God, is that he is all of it. He is chapter 11, he is chapter 12, and he is every chapter of your entire life. That is who he is. Amen. That's who we believe in. And I just added a little bit of chapter 12 that you might find tons. This one's so good. So many things that you'll love. My favorite is on at the very end of chapter 12, verses 29, 30, that he sends angels. And I love verse 30. And they began from that time forth to call on his name. Therefore, God conversed with men. I have that highlighted 18 million times, just 8 boxes over it, that we have a God that will talk to us. And that is powerful. That not only is he going to let us in his throne room and hear us out, but in all reality, he will talk to us about it as well. He's not just hearing our pleas, he's going to reply to them. And there's so many, he claims you. I love that in verse 34. Therefore, whosoever repenteth and hardeneth not his heart, he shall have claim on mercy through mine only begotten Son, unto a remission of his sins, and these shall enter into my rest.
I love that one.
I know.
Because I can have claim on him, but the fact that he wants to claim me.
And even more so in the same sentence with your sins.
Yeah.
That he is not saying, I'm claiming you, pretending you're perfect.
Once you figure it out, then I'll pick you for the team.
No.
But he's the fact that he's you know what I'm saying? Where you're I just said, right now, we just ended baseball season, going to all the kids' games and stuff like that. And when your kid, makes a good hit, that's when you want to stand up and be that's my kid. And then
he strikes out.
But God stands up in the bleachers when he strikes out and still says, that's my kid.
100%. 100%.
That one gets me.
I know. And so you're just going to find all of those and just highlight them and write them on your little paper. But I love verse number 25 as well, because it says, now if it had not been for the plan of redemption, which was laid from the foundation of the world. This was the plan A. Jesus was plan A. Us making mistakes and falling apart and giving way to temptation and doing the things that we swore we'd never do was actually plan A. That's not plan B. He's not like, oh, I better figure out a way to fix this. This is going to be a disaster that you fell apart. He said, no, wait. Redemption was the plan all along.
Yeah.
Jesus was the plan all along. He expects you to make mistakes. That's why he gave us Jesus. And he said, I am going to give you Jesus so that you can experience redemption. That is my plan A. From the foundation of the world, from day one, that's what I had in mind for you. And to me, that is way worth anything else, because there are not a lot of people that will claim you in your mistakes.
Yeah. And we've got 2 missionaries who are like walking, talking examples of that.
Yeah.
You know, they were like, we stand as witnesses of God at all times and all places. Okay, we are witnesses of who God is and what he can do with
For
a person. You know, it's so awesome. Okay, I told you at the beginning, I told you so, you didn't believe me. Now you'll repent of that. And more good stuff next week. We will see you then. Have a great week, everyone.